John Callahan was a man of the Wild West, a rancher who had spent years in the rough and unforgiving land. His cattle roamed freely across the dusty plains, and his life had been one of simple routines until that evening. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch. John was returning from a long day of rounding up cattle, his horse's hooves kicking up dust with each slow step. The breeze was cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and earth. It was a peaceful evening, but the stillness would not last. As John rode along the familiar trail that led back to his ranch house, he thought of the quiet life he had built here. He wasn't a man of many words. His cattle and the open land were his companions. But he wasn't lonely. In this land, loneliness was something you learned to live with. It had been years since he had seen another soul besides the local Apache tribe, and even then their interactions had always been tense but respectful. Suddenly, a faint cry broke the stillness of the evening. It was a sound so desperate, so filled with fear that it made John's heart skip a beat. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Another cry, this time more urgent, cut through the air. Someone was in trouble. John immediately spurred his horse forward, guiding it toward the sound. His instincts, honed from years of living in the wilderness, told him that something was terribly wrong. He had learned long ago that in these parts trouble wasn't far behind when you heard cries like that. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle on his saddle just in case. The horse galloped faster now, its hooves thundering against the hard earth as they raced toward the sound. After a few minutes, John crested a hill and saw a small figure in the distance. It was a boy, barely more than a child, stumbling along the ground, his face covered in dirt and blood. John slowed his horse and called out, "Hey there, boy. Are you all right?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide with fear, and rushed toward him. John could see that the boy was hurt. His clothes were torn and his face was bruised. The boy was covered in the marks of someone who had been through hell. He barely seemed able to stand, but he was determined, his legs shaking with every step. "I need help," the boy gasped, his voice trembling. "Please help my mother. They're going to hang her." John was stunned. The boy's words hit him like a punch in the gut. He didn't understand what was happening, but it was clear that something awful was going on. "Who's going to hang your mother?" John asked, trying to make sense of the situation. "The Kiowa," the boy replied, his eyes welling up with tears. "They've got her. They say she betrayed them. They're going to kill her. Please, you have to help." John's mind raced. The Kiowa were a neighboring tribe that John had heard of but never dealt with directly. There had always been stories about the Kiowa being fierce, unyielding, and quick to anger. He knew enough to understand that helping this boy could lead to a conflict he wasn't prepared for. But looking into the boy's eyes, John felt a pang of sympathy. No child should have to witness their mother being killed, and no one should die in such a brutal manner. John's grip tightened on the reins of his horse. The boy was now standing before him, desperate and pleading. There was no time to waste. The Kiowa were not known for their mercy, and if they had taken the boy's mother, they would show none. "I'll help you," John said, his voice firm. "But we need to move fast." The boy nodded vigorously, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you. Thank you so much." John swung down from his horse and helped the boy onto the saddle in front of him. Without another word, he urged his horse forward, taking the fastest route he knew toward the Kiowa's encampment. The boy directed him, his voice shaky as he described the camp. John listened carefully, trying to learn as much as he could while keeping his mind focused on the task ahead. As they rode, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a rescue. There was something deeper at play, something that could have far-reaching consequences. The Kiowa weren't known for making mistakes, and John couldn't help but wonder what had led them to accuse this woman of betrayal. But now wasn't the time to think about that. His focus had to be on getting the boy's mother out of danger. The land around them grew more rugged as they traveled. The path grew narrower, the hills steeper. The wind picked up and the night began to settle in. The boy, to watch as he had introduced himself, kept looking back toward the horizon as if expecting someone or something to appear. His hands gripped the reins tightly, and his body was tense, ready to bolt at a moment's notice. "You're brave," John said after a while, trying to break the silence. "Most boys your age would be too scared to do what you've done." Tawach looked up at him, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and admiration. "I have to be brave," he said quietly. "My mother, she's all I have. My father, he's gone. And if I don't save her, who will? John was silent for a moment, taking in the boy's words. There was a sadness in his voice, one that came from having experienced loss far too early. John didn't know much about the Apache way of life, but he knew enough to understand that family was everything. Tawak had lost his father, and now he feared losing his mother too. The path grew darker as they rode on. The only sound now the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the occasional rustle of the wind through the dry grass. John's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The Kiowa were dangerous, and a direct confrontation could end in disaster. He would have to think of a plan. One wrong move and they could all be killed. As they approached the outskirts of the Kiowa camp, John slowed the horse to a walk. He needed to assess the situation carefully. Tawak had told him that his mother was tied to a tree, guarded by 2 warriors. That was both good and bad. It meant they had a chance, but it also meant they were on a tight deadline. If the Kiowa were as ruthless as he had heard, they wouldn't hesitate to carry out their threat. John pulled his horse into the shadows of a nearby ridge, keeping a low profile. Tawash leaned forward, pointing toward the camp in the distance. "That's where they're keeping her," he whispered. John nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. He needed a way to get close without alerting the warriors. The last thing he wanted was to engage in a firefight. He had to be smarter than that. "We'll have to move fast," John said. "You stay here, out of sight. I'll go in first." Tawach's eyes widened with fear. "You can't go alone." "They'll kill you." John gave the boy a reassuring look. "I'll be fine. Just stay hidden, and when I give the signal, you come running. Understand?" Tawach nodded, but it was clear he was terrified. "Please hurry." With one last glance at the boy, John crept forward, his senses alert to every movement in the darkness. He knew this would be the most dangerous part of the mission. But there was no turning back now. Tawak's mother's life depended on him. As John moved closer to the camp, the tension in the air grew thicker. He couldn't afford to make a sound. The Kiowa would be listening for anything unusual. His heart pounded in his chest, but he stayed focused. If he failed, Tawach would lose everything. As John moved silently through the night, the weight of what he was about to do settled heavily on his shoulders. Every step felt deliberate, as though the ground itself might betray him with the slightest sound. The Kiowa camp was just ahead, a faint glow from the fire barely visible between the rocks and brush. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the dry desert air, carrying with it an eerie sense of danger. The wind had died down, leaving behind a quiet that almost felt suffocating. John crouched low, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the camp. He could see the silhouettes of several warriors gathered around the fire, laughing and talking in their own language. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the silence. He knew this was the moment of truth. Tawach's mother was just a few yards away, tied to a tree, guarded by 2 men. John's heart raced as he carefully moved closer, each step calculated and cautious. He had to be quick, time was running out. Tawach had told him that his mother had been accused of betrayal by the Kiowa. She was a woman of the Apache, but she had been captured and held by the Kiowa after a skirmish between the 2 tribes. The Kiowa believed she had given information to their enemies, the Comanche, which had led to an attack on their camp. Now they planned to hang her at dawn to make an example of her. John's blood boiled at the thought of such a fate. He couldn't allow it to happen. No one should die like that, especially not a woman who had been caught in the middle of something she couldn't control. John's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a horse snorting in the distance. He froze. He knew the Kiowa had horses nearby, but this sound was different. It was coming closer. John quickly dove behind a boulder, pressing his back against the rough stone, barely daring to breathe. The sound grew louder as the rider approached. He peeked around the edge of the rock and saw one of the Kiowa warriors riding toward the camp. His horse moved slowly, and John could make out the faint outline of the rider's figure in the dim light. The warrior passed by, unaware of John's presence. The tension in John's chest eased slightly, but he knew he couldn't waste any more time. He had to move fast. The warrior would soon be back, and if he was seen, everything would fall apart. The rescue would fail before it even had a chance. John took a deep breath and pressed forward. His goal was clear: get to the woman, untie her, and get her out of the camp. If he could get her to safety, Tawach would have a chance to escape with her. But it wasn't just about saving one woman. This could lead to something bigger, something that could change the way John saw the entire situation between the tribes. When John reached the edge of the camp, he could hear the guards talking, though their words were muffled by the distance. They were too far from the fire to see him, but he needed to be cautious. He couldn't risk getting too close. If they noticed him now, there would be no escape. The only way was to outsmart them. Taking a deep breath, John crouched low and moved behind the camp's sheltering rocks, using them for cover as he approached the tree where Tawach's mother was tied. The ropes around her wrists were tight, the marks of the harsh bindings clear against her skin. Her head hung low, her long dark hair tangled from the ordeal she had endured. Her breathing was shallow, as though every breath was a struggle. John felt his heart go out to her. He could see that she was still alive, but barely. There was no time to waste. He reached for the knife strapped to his side, his fingers trembling slightly. As he cut through the ropes, he noticed the woman's eyes flickering open. She was weak, but she was aware. She gazed up at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. John whispered to her gently, trying to calm her. "Stay quiet," he said softly. "I'm here to get you out." She nodded weakly, her eyes wide with a combination of hope and disbelief. John cut through the last of the ropes and she slowly sank to the ground, unable to stand on her own. Her legs trembled and she winced in pain as she tried to rise. John reached out and gently helped her to her feet, careful not to make a sound. They couldn't afford to alert the guards now. Behind them, the sound of the Kiowa warriors' voices grew louder as they moved around the camp, still unaware of what was happening. John's heart raced. He had to get the woman out of here, but the path back to safety was too exposed. He couldn't take the same route they had come in. It would be too dangerous. John's eyes scanned the area. There was a ridge just beyond the camp, a narrow path that led through a grove of trees. It would be their best chance, but it meant they would have to move quickly. "Every second counted. Follow me," John whispered to the woman. "Stay close." She nodded, her face pale and drawn, but she seemed to understand. She followed him as best she could, though her legs wobbled beneath her. John kept his pace steady, trying not to move too fast so as not to draw attention, but urgency weighed on him. He could hear the warriors getting closer. They had to make it to the ridge before they were seen. As they moved toward the trees, a low voice rang out behind them. "Who's there?" John froze, his blood turning cold. The voice was just a few yards away, and the sound of footsteps followed. He turned quickly, pushing the woman behind him and drawing his rifle in one fluid motion. There were 2 Kiowa warriors now moving toward them. They hadn't seen them yet, but they were close. John's mind raced. He had no choice now. If they were going to get out alive, he would have to fight. He raised his rifle, taking aim at the first warrior. The shot rang out in the still night air, and the man dropped to the ground without a sound. The second warrior turned just in time to see his companion fall. He reached for his weapon, but John was faster. He fired again, hitting the second man square in the chest. The silence that followed was deafening. John's heart hammered in his chest as he watched the 2 men fall, their bodies crumpling to the ground. The woman, still weak, gasped in fear, but John quickly motioned for her to stay quiet. "We need to go," he said urgently. "Now!" Without looking back, John grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the ridge. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the wind, but John could still hear the distant murmurs of the Kiowa camp. He knew it wouldn't be long before more warriors came to investigate. They had to move fast. They reached the ridge and quickly disappeared into the trees. John glanced back once, making sure no one was following. For now they were safe, but the night was far from over. John's heart pounded as he and the woman, her name still unknown to him, moved quickly through the trees. The path was narrow and uneven, but it was their only option. The night was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. John knew they couldn't stop to rest. Not until they were far enough away from the Kiowa camp. The rifle he carried felt heavy in his hands, but he knew he couldn't afford to be careless. Every step had to count. The woman stumbled beside him, her strength almost gone. John glanced at her, concern creeping into his chest. Her clothes were torn and her face was pale, marked with exhaustion and fear. He had seen many things in his years in the West, but the look in her eyes, haunted and defeated, struck him deeply. He didn't know how much longer she could keep going. "We're going to make it," John whispered, more to himself than to her. "Just keep walking." She nodded silently, but John could see the struggle in her eyes. He had to keep her moving. They moved swiftly through the dense trees, their footsteps muffled by the dry leaves scattered on the ground. The air had grown colder as the night wore on, and the wind had picked up again. John felt the chill biting into his skin, but he didn't stop. They couldn't afford to stop, not yet. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a small creek, its water running steadily over rocks. The sound of the flowing water was soothing, but John knew they couldn't rest here for long. The Kiowa warriors could be hot on their trail by now. He scanned the area, looking for the best route forward. "Stay low," John murmured to the woman. She crouched beside him, her body shaking. Her breathing was shallow, and John could see that she was struggling to keep up. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had dragged her into this dangerous situation, and now her life depended on his decisions. "Are you all right?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded weakly, but it was clear that the ordeal had taken a toll on her. "I'll be fine," she whispered. "I have to be." John gave her a reassuring smile, though he wasn't sure if it was for her or himself. They couldn't stop here. The creek was their chance to cross into more familiar territory, away from the Kiowa's reach. Without saying another word, he led the way across the creek, the water cold as it splashed over his boots. The woman followed as best as she could, her feet slipping on the wet rocks. John reached out to steady her, his hand strong but gentle. "Hold on," he said, steadying her as she nearly lost her footing. "We'll be out of here soon." They crossed the creek without incident, but the sense of urgency didn't leave John. Every sound in the night felt like it was amplified, and the rustling of leaves seemed to echo in the silence. He kept his eyes ahead, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The trees began to thin as they moved deeper into the wilderness. The ridge that John had spotted earlier was still some distance away, but it would give them the high ground. From there they could figure out their next move. But first they had to make it through the open space ahead without being seen. "Can you walk a bit faster?" John asked softly, glancing over at her. She was clearly struggling, but he knew they had no time to lose. The woman's face tightened with determination. "I can do it," she replied. Just a little more." John nodded and picked up the pace, moving through the trees with long strides. The woman struggled to keep up, her body trembling with each step. He kept glancing back at her, his concern growing. He had to get them both to safety, but he couldn't carry her, not with the Kiowa so close. As they neared the edge of the trees, John stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. He listened intently, his ears straining against the night. The sound of hooves, they were being followed. John's heart dropped. The Kiowa must have realized the woman was gone by now. They were tracking them, getting closer with every passing minute. John's mind raced. They couldn't outrun them. The only way to survive this was to make a stand. "Get behind me," John whispered, his voice low but firm. "Stay quiet. Don't move unless I tell you." The woman didn't need to be told twice. She pressed herself against the trees, her eyes wide with fear. John motioned for her to stay put, then crouched low, trying to blend into the shadows of the underbrush. He could see the movement of horses in the distance, 2 riders moving swiftly through the trees. John held his breath, waiting for the right moment. The riders were getting closer, but they hadn't spotted him yet. He could hear them speaking in low tones, but he couldn't make out their words. The wind shifted, and John knew they were getting too close. He had to make a decision. John waited until the riders were almost directly above them, just a few yards away. He could hear the thud of hooves on the soft ground, the sound of their horses breathing. And then, he acted. John lunged forward, drawing his rifle in one swift motion. He aimed at the first rider, his shot loud in the still night air. The Kiowa warrior fell from his horse with a grunt, but the second rider was already pulling his weapon, turning to face John. Another shot rang out, but John was faster. He fired just as the second rider drew his knife, hitting the man in the chest. The Kiowa warrior collapsed, his body hitting the ground with a thud. John stood over the 2 fallen men, his chest heaving with the adrenaline that surged through him. The woman, still hidden, was trembling, but she remained silent. John turned to her and motioned to keep moving. "We have to go," he said urgently. Now they couldn't stay here for long. The sound of the gunfire would have drawn more attention, and the rest of the Kiowa warriors would be on their way. John grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her to her feet, urging her to keep moving. They didn't have much time. They had to get to the ridge before more Kiowa arrived. The woman stumbled beside him, her legs shaking, but she kept moving. John kept his pace steady, his rifle still ready in case they were ambushed. As they reached the ridge, the faint glow of the Kiowa camp was now far behind them, but John knew it wouldn't be long before they realized something was wrong. The chase was far from over, but for now they had a chance to breathe. John helped the woman up the steep ridge, his hands strong as he guided her up the rocky path. She didn't say a word, but her grip on his arm tightened and John could feel her strength slowly returning. They had made it this far, but the real test was still ahead. At the top of the ridge, they stopped to catch their breath. John took a moment to scan the land below, his eyes searching for any signs of movement. The moonlight bathed the valley in silver, and the wind whispered through the trees. For a brief moment it felt as though they were safe, but the feeling didn't last. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light illuminating the path ahead. John stood at the top of the ridge, breathing heavily, but even the cool night air couldn't ease the tension in his chest. The sounds of the Kiowa camp were now distant, but he knew they wouldn't remain unaware for long. They would send scouts, search parties, whatever it took to find the woman he had rescued. The night was far from over. John turned to the woman, still struggling to catch her breath. She was leaning against a nearby rock, her body trembling from exhaustion. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of urgency. She had been through so much already, and it was clear she was running on sheer willpower. But John knew that they couldn't stay here for long. Not with the Kiowa close behind. We need to keep moving, he said quietly but firmly. We can't stop here. They'll catch up to us. The woman nodded, though her eyes were filled with weariness. She had been through more than any person should endure, and yet here she was, still fighting, still alive. John admired her strength, but he also knew that this wasn't over. The Kiowa would not give up easily. He reached out and gently took her arm, helping her back onto her feet. Her legs were weak, but she managed to stand. John offered a reassuring smile, though he wasn't sure if she saw it through her exhaustion. I'll keep you safe, he said softly. We just have to keep moving. Together they made their way down the ridge, moving slowly but steadily. The trees began to thin out, and they found themselves walking through an open patch of land, the cool breeze brushing against their faces. The moonlight revealed the vast desert ahead, and John knew they were getting closer to a place that might offer some shelter. We'll head toward the canyon, John said as they walked. There's a cave there. We can rest for a bit and figure out our next move. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, nodded silently. She didn't speak much, but John could tell she was grateful for the direction he was giving her. In a way, he was doing the same for himself. He had been alone for so long that the thought of someone else depending on him felt strange. But there was no turning back now. They had to survive this together. As they walked, John kept a keen eye on the land around them. The Kiowa could be anywhere, and he knew they would be watching for any sign of movement. He kept his rifle ready, his senses sharp. Every rustle in the bushes, every shift in the wind made him pause, listening intently. He had been in situations like this before, but this time was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about making sure they both made it out alive. The ground beneath their feet grew more uneven as they continued their journey. The trees were fewer now, replaced by rocky outcrops and dry brush. John's thoughts were focused on the canyon. If they could reach it, they might be able to rest for a while and plan their next move. But the canyon was a few miles away, and it wasn't a place to linger for too long. It was a dead end if the Kiowa found them. Just then, the sound of hooves reached John's ears. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively pulled the woman closer, taking cover behind a large boulder. The sound of the horses grew louder, and John's grip tightened on his rifle. The Kiowa were here. They were getting closer, and they couldn't afford to be seen. The woman looked at him with wide eyes, her body pressed against the rock. She was scared, but she trusted him. John could see it in her eyes. He motioned for her to stay still and quiet, and they waited. The sound of hooves passed by, growing fainter, but John didn't relax. He knew the Kiowa wouldn't give up that easily. They would be looking for signs of their escape, and if they came across their trail, it wouldn't be long before they were on their heels again. The night felt like it had stretched on for hours, though it was still only a few minutes since they had heard the horses. John peered around the rock, watching the riders move past. They were headed in the opposite direction, but he knew that wouldn't last long. They would circle back. They always did. Once the sound of the horses faded completely, John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked at the woman who was still pressed close to the rock, her eyes wide with fear. He gave her a small nod, signaling that it was safe to move again. "We need to keep going," he said quietly, his voice calm but urgent. "Just a little farther." The woman didn't hesitate. She nodded, her body still trembling, but she pushed herself up from the rock and started walking again, slower this time. John matched her pace, his mind still racing. They had to make it to the canyon. They just had to. The desert stretched out before them, an endless sea of sand and rock. The canyon was still in the distance, but John could see the faint outline of the cliffs rising up ahead. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had stood in the safety of his ranch, just a man with his cattle, unaware of the chaos that would soon engulf him. John had never been one for sentimentality. But as he walked beside this woman, knowing she had lost so much, he couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong. How had it come to this? He had always lived by a simple code: survive and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But now, as he guided the woman through the darkness, he realized that survival wasn't just about the physical fight. It was about hope. It was about the strength to keep going even when everything seemed lost. They walked for what felt like hours, their footsteps steady but quiet, until the canyon came into view. John's heart lifted slightly at the sight. They were close, so close. The path down into the canyon was steep, but they could make it. It would be dangerous, but it was their best chance at shelter. As they descended into the canyon, John's mind was focused on what lay ahead. He wasn't sure how long they could stay hidden in the canyon, but it would have to be enough. The Kiowa weren't far behind, and he knew they had to move fast. The woman was struggling to keep up, her body giving out, but she kept moving, determined to survive. They reached the bottom of the canyon, and John found a narrow cave that he had used in the past for shelter. It was small, but it would be enough for a short rest. They wouldn't be safe for long, but it was a place to hide, at least for the moment. "Stay here," John said softly. "I'll keep watch." The woman nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. She sat down against the cave wall, her body slumping from the weight of everything that had happened. John crouched near the entrance of the cave, his rifle ready, his senses alert to every sound in the night. He could hear the wind picking up again, the sound of the dry leaves swirling through the air. The canyon was quieter now, but he knew it wouldn't last. As he kept watch, John's thoughts returned to the woman. He wondered about her story, about what had led her to this point. He had never asked for details. He hadn't wanted to burden her further. But in the quiet of the canyon, with the danger still looming, he realized that everyone had a story. Everyone had a reason for doing what they did. And sometimes all you could do was try to make things right, even if the world around you seemed like it was falling apart. The canyon was a silent, almost eerie place in the dark of night. The air was thick with tension as John kept his watch. He had positioned himself by the entrance of the cave, his back pressed against the cold stone, his rifle ready. He could hear the distant sounds of the desert, the wind whispering through the rocks, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But it wasn't the wind or the animals that made his heart race. It was the knowledge that the Kiowa could be anywhere. John's eyes kept darting to the narrow path leading down into the canyon, his mind alert to every movement, every shift in the air. He had been in situations like this before where danger was just around the corner, but this felt different. This time he wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting someone else, someone who had been through so much already and still had the strength to keep moving forward. That was what drove him now, the thought that if he failed, she would be lost. He couldn't let that happen. The woman still sitting in the corner of the cave looked more at ease than she had in hours. Her body was exhausted, but she was still alive. Her eyes were closed, her head resting against the wall, and she seemed to be gathering what little strength she had left. John watched her for a moment, wondering what had brought her to this point. What had happened to her that made her so strong, so determined to survive? He didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let her down. The Kiowa would come. It was only a matter of time. They wouldn't stop until they found her, and if they found her, they wouldn't hesitate. John had seen enough cruelty in his life to know how ruthless the Kiowa could be. He couldn't let that happen. He had to keep them both safe. As the hours stretched on, the stillness of the canyon seemed to grow more intense. The wind had died down, and the desert around them had fallen into an uneasy silence. The woman shifted slightly, her body stiff from exhaustion. She opened her eyes and looked at John. Her gaze was steady, though there was still fear in her eyes. She had been through so much, but she wasn't giving up. John admired that about her. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, though it was clear that she was struggling to stay awake. I'm fine," she said, her voice weak but determined. "Thank you for saving me." John smiled faintly, though he could tell she didn't have the energy to say much more. "You've done all the hard work," he replied quietly. "You've survived this far." There was a long pause as they both sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. John's mind was racing, going over their options. They couldn't stay here forever. The Kiowa would find them eventually, and when they did, there would be no more hiding. They would need to leave the canyon, but where would they go? How would they escape? The desert was vast, and they were vulnerable out in the open. Suddenly, John heard the faint sound of hooves again. His heart skipped a beat, and he froze. The sound wasn't close yet, but it was coming. The Kiowa were on their way. John's grip tightened on his rifle. He didn't want to risk a firefight. Not here, not now. They needed to get out of the canyon. The longer they stayed, the greater the chance of being trapped. The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "They're coming, aren't they?" John nodded, his mind already working through their options. "We need to move, and we need to move fast," he said quietly. "I'll go first. You follow behind me and stay close. Don't stop for anything." The woman didn't hesitate. She nodded, though her face was still pale with exhaustion. John could see the fear in her eyes, but she didn't complain. She had been through so much already, and now wasn't the time to falter. She had to keep going. They both did. John motioned for her to follow and led the way out of the cave. He moved quickly but quietly, staying low to the ground. They had to be careful. The Kiowa could be anywhere, and if they were spotted now, there would be no escape. The canyon was narrow and winding, offering them some cover, but it also meant they had fewer places to hide. They had to move toward the hills in the distance, higher ground where they could get a better view of their surroundings. As they moved through the canyon, John's mind raced with possible escape routes. He knew they couldn't outrun the Kiowa for long. The only chance they had was to outsmart them. They had to find a way to make it to the hills without being seen, and then figure out their next move from there. But time was running out. He could hear the hooves getting closer, and he knew they had to reach the hills before the Kiowa caught up. The woman, though weak, kept up with him. She stumbled a few times, but John was there to catch her each time. He didn't want to carry her. He couldn't afford to be slowed down, but he would if he had to. As long as they both made it out, it didn't matter what it took. They reached the base of the hills just as the sound of the Kiowa's horses grew louder. John could feel the pressure building in his chest. They had made it this far, but they weren't safe yet. The hills would give them some protection, but they still had to climb them without being seen. If the Kiowa saw them, they would have nowhere to hide. John looked up at the steep slope ahead. It was a tough climb, but they could make it. He glanced at the woman, who was breathing heavily but still standing tall. "We're almost there," he said quietly, trying to reassure her. "Just a little farther." She nodded, though John could see the pain in her eyes. She was exhausted, but she didn't stop. She followed him up the hill, step by step, her legs shaking from the effort. John kept a close eye on the path behind them, knowing that the Kiowa could be on their trail at any moment. The climb was difficult, and John could feel his own strength starting to fade. He had been on his feet for hours, and every step felt heavier than the last. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not when they were so close. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the top of the hill. John paused to catch his breath, scanning the horizon. The Kiowa's camp was far behind them now, and the night seemed to stretch out before them, vast and empty. They had made it. "For now. We're safe for the moment," John said, though he knew it wasn't over. The Kiowa wouldn't give up easily, and they would have to keep moving. But at least for now, they had a chance to rest, to regroup, and to plan their next move. The woman, still breathing heavily, sank to the ground beside him. She looked up at the stars, her eyes reflecting a mix of relief and exhaustion. For the first time since they had met, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for everything." John nodded, though he didn't have the words to respond. There was nothing he could say that would change what had happened. But he could promise her this. He wouldn't stop. Not until she was safe.